Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books Founders Series, Jane Calvert on the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania.
Welcome to the PA Books Founders Series. I'm Phil Beckman. In 1767, a series of essays were published in the Pennsylvania Chronicle and Universal Advertiser that are known as the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. They were written by John Dickinson in response to the British Parliament's Declaratory Act and the Townshend Acts. Joining us to talk about Dickinson's letters is Jane Calvert. She is an associate professor of history at the University of Kentucky and the director and editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project. Jane, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start at the very beginning here. Who was John Dickinson?
John Dickinson was America's first political celebrity. He was born in Maryland, raised in what we now call Delaware, which was the three lower counties of Pennsylvania. He went to London to study law at the Middle Temple. He returned and served in the legislature of the three lower counties, then in the legislature of Pennsylvania. And he started becoming active in the resistance to Britain during the Stamp Act. He started writing at that time, and whereas the other writers at the time were elite men writing to other elite men, he took a different approach, and rather than presenting a theoretical discussion about why the taxes were wrong, he decided to give Americans something like a how-to guide to resist. And so after the Stamp Act was repealed and then the Declaratory Act was passed, the Parliament more or less gave with one hand and took away with the other. And the Declaratory Act declared that Parliament could legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And they didn't do anything immediately, but then the next year they passed the Townshend duties, the Townshend Acts. And nobody seemed to respond. Nobody seemed to be at all alarmed by these. And so Dickinson, a highly trained lawyer who understood how important precedent was, he kind of looked around and thought somebody should do something. And so he stepped forward and wrote this series of 12 letters, which, as you noted at the beginning, were then published in the Pennsylvania newspapers and then published in most of the newspapers around the colonies, around the Atlantic world, in England, in Ireland, in France, and he became the first transatlantic celebrity. And so there were a couple other of our sort of leading founders who were known at the time. Benjamin Franklin, of course, was famous for his scientific experiments, and George Washington had been known from earlier from his journal about the French and Indian War. But Dickinson just really sort of launched into stardom and became more or less a household name as soon as his identity was known. And so there were images of him and statues and tributes and toasts and just all manner of recognition. And so from that point on until about 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, he was really seen as the spokesman for the American cause. And everybody, well, not everybody, but that's an exaggeration. But people looked to him for advice about how to resist the British, and he went on and provided this leadership for as long as his country would allow it.
Was he, in the years before he wrote these letters, was he associated with a particular political faction?
No. This is where the history gets a little bit confused. So he was claimed by factions. So the Pennsylvania political situation at the time was extraordinarily complicated, and there were political factions. There was the Quaker Party, and there was the Proprietary Party, and some lesser factions. And where we see this really come to the fore was that the so-called Quaker Party, they got it in their heads that they would like to abolish the Charter of Pennsylvania from 1701, and this was the charter that gave Quakers all of their unique liberties. And of course the Proprietary faction that was the faction supporting the Penn family. Of course, they didn't want the charter abolished, because if Pennsylvania were placed under control of the Crown, that would mean that the Penn family would lose their proprietorship. So at this point, Dickinson was greatly alarmed because he did not want the Constitution abolished. He thought it was an extremely dangerous move, and he warned that Quakers would lose their religious liberty and the other rights that allowed them to practice law and politics in Pennsylvania, including voting and holding office and serving on juries, and more or less any kind of civic activity that required an oath or a religious test. So he stood on the side of the charter, but as factions will do, they kind of lined up behind him, and so historians kind of saw that as Dickinson taking the proprietary side or the Presbyterian side against the Quakers, but it wasn't that simple. And really, Dickinson's main aim throughout the whole contest was to preserve the charter.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the Stamp Act, since so many of the Declaratory Act and the others can follow out of that. What was the Stamp Act? What was it intended to do?
So after the end of the French and Indian War, Britain was in debt and was looking to have the colonists bear more weight of the expenses of the war. And so it ended in 1763. And shortly after that, they started passing revenue acts, and this was a new kind of legislation for Parliament. So for decades before this, Americans had been under what Edmund Burke called a sort of an informal policy of salutary neglect. So basically, Britain more or less left America alone to do what Americans wanted to do, and Americans kind of quietly evaded any navigation acts to control the trade. And Britain, it was okay, it worked for everybody. But then once Britain started cracking down and seeking revenue, and started passing these laws. So the Stamp Act was it decreed that any paper used in the colonies for really any purpose had to receive a royal stamp, kind of an embossed stamp. And otherwise, the proceedings that wouldn't be valid. So this went from everything from playing cards to legal documents to newspapers, and it would greatly interfere with the business of the colonies, and it would be very expensive. And most importantly, its purpose was not to regulate trade, which all Americans agreed was not just acceptable but desirable. This was to raise a revenue. And so there were a great deal of protests up and down the coast, and some of them were violent, but there was the Stamp Act Congress that met in New York, and Dickinson was a delegate there, and this was the first kind of a quasi-national body of Americans. And Dickinson more or less served as the draftsman for that Congress. He wrote the documents that it produced, declaring their rights and their objection to the Stamp Act. And then as soon as he went home, he started publishing pamphlets that basically served to instruct the colonists on how to resist properly. And although these documents by Dickinson are not as well known as his later documents, One of the most important one is a little, one-page broadside called Friends and Countrymen. And in this, he very clearly laid out exactly why the Stamp Act was dangerous and what the colonists should do. And he said that the colonists should simply ignore the act and engage in their quote-unquote business as usual. And this is the first statement of encouraging people to practice what we now call civil disobedience. This was a mode of resistance that Quakers had pioneered back in the 17th century to secure their religious liberty. And Dickinson was raised by Quakers in a Quaker family, and he later married into one of the most powerful Quaker families in Pennsylvania. And so he had this as part of his heritage, and he could make this unique suggestion. And people around the colonies, they read this, and the Sons of Liberty adopted it, and people in Connecticut adopted it, and it was much more effective either than rioting or simply evading the act, which was more or less the only way the colonists had figured out how to resist it before. And so through all of these means, both violent and nonviolent, these all contributed to the repeal of the Stamp Act.
Now, once the Stamp Act was repealed, you had mentioned the Declaratory Act. So how did that come into play at that time?
Well, of course, Parliament did not like that the colonists had resisted this act, and so they went ahead and said, "Fine, we'll repeal this act." But we are going to assert our authority over you. In England at the time, there was what's called the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, and so they asserted this, and it basically said that the Parliament can legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever.
And another series of acts, which you mentioned previously, were the Townshend duties. Did they come around at the same time as the Declaratory Act, or was it later that they would be implemented?
They came about the next year, and it was a series of five acts, and they were, for various purposes. They were to raise revenue. They were to punish the colonists for not obeying earlier acts. For example, the New York Restraining Act was to punish New York by suspending its legislature because New Yorkers had not obeyed the Quartering Act, which had been passed earlier. And so basically it was just a very aggressive assertion of authority by Parliament over the colonists, and very threatening.
At what point here did Dickinson decide that he wanted to write about dealing with these two works?
Well, he'd been keeping a close eye on Britain and these dangerous policies, and so we don't know exactly when he began drafting the letters, but I think it must have been maybe the late fall of 1767, and we're pretty certain that he wrote them all at one time, and then started publishing them one by one in 12 weeks, beginning in late October or early December of 1767, and then they were finished in February, and then shortly after that they appeared in pamphlet form in multiple editions. And scholars have studied the publication histories of multiple pamphlets, and it was for a long time thought that Common Sense sold more pamphlets than any other pamphlet during this era. But subsequent scholarship has determined that the Farmer's Letters probably sold about as many copies as Common Sense.
Talk a little bit about the print culture in the colonies at that time. It sounds like there were printing presses all open throughout the colonies as his letters were being reprinted. What role did this printing culture play in the politics and the political discussions?
Well, That's a big topic, and yes, all the colonies had newspapers, printing presses. They were, as they are now, they were highly political, generally serving one faction or another. Sometimes the politicians actually were partners in the newspapers and controlled what could go into the papers. So. So, for example, one of the papers that published the farmers' letters was the Pennsylvania Chronicle, and that was it was William Goddard who was the editor and the printer, but his partner was Joseph Galloway, and Joseph Galloway was Dickinson's nemesis. The two had been clashing since as early as 1758, shortly after Dickinson finished his legal training, and they really pretty much despised each other. And so when William Goddard published the farmers' letters in this paper that Galloway, was partly responsible for, Galloway was furious, and the problem was that these letters were so wildly popular that he really would not have been able to avoid printing them. But yes, they were. Printers actually, one of the printers of a paper in New York actually funded the publication of the farmers' letters himself because he thought that they were so important and that everybody should read them. And there were people who disliked the farmers' letters, people who would later become loyalists, like Benjamin Franklin's son, William Franklin, and so they would sort of wring their hands and complain that the letters were very popular among the ordinary people because they were written in such a smooth style.
Now, given the widespread nature of this printing culture, was literacy common throughout the colonies? Yes. Americans tended to be more literate than their European counterparts, but the problem was not just that the lower sorts of people, the working people, the poor, they would possibly be illiterate, but they also just didn't have time. So even if they could read, they were too busy with work to really take the time to read something like this. And so Dickinson actually took great care. One of his main concerns in these letters, and in fact pretty much everything he wrote, was that he wanted to speak to and reach ordinary laboring Americans and educate them on their rights, their responsibilities, and the way that they should resist. In fact, in the very first letter, Dickinson says that this is just one of the greatest lines, I think. He says, as a charitable but poor person does not withhold his mite because he cannot relieve all the distresses of the miserable, so should not any honest man suppress his sentiments concerning freedom, however small their influence is likely to be. Perhaps he may touch some wheel that will have an effect greater than he could reasonably expect. And so this is very unusual because a lot of elite writers kind of paid lip service to engaging the people, but it was widely understood that poor people, because they were lacking in education, because they were dependent on wealthier people, that they were lacking in sort of a key component for political participation at the time, which was virtue, and so Dickinson is really kind of breaking the mold here by reaching out to ordinary people and saying it doesn't matter if you're poor. That you should engage anyway, and you have a duty to do so. And he actually directed his seventh letter specifically to the laboring people who didn't have very much time or means to educate themselves on the political situation or the legal situation.
And this was a theme that he continued throughout his work in another set of letters called the Fabius Letters that he wrote to try to secure ratification of the Constitution in 1788. He again said that everybody has not just a right but a duty to voice their opinions on these momentous affairs of state.
Now, in the very first letter, the very first lines of the first letter, he writes, I am a farmer settled after a variety of fortunes near the banks of the River Delaware in the province of Pennsylvania. I received a liberal education and have been engaged in the busy scenes of life. Why didn't he say, I'm a lawyer in Philadelphia?
Very much like today, a lot of people didn't like lawyers. They were often seen as charlatans, shady, sketchy people just sort of out for their own interests. And although Dickinson was exactly the opposite of that kind of lawyer, he was highly principled. A lawyer, that was not going to grab people's attention. He wanted a persona that would be both respected and trusted by both the elites and the common people. And so the farmer has sort of layered implications. So it would evoke, certainly among most elite Americans, sort of the ideal of the independent Roman citizen, working his land and defending his land, and that he would be independent because he owned this land, and he would be honest and virtuous because he worked this land. Now, nobody mistook Dickinson for an actual farmer who was, walking behind a plow or getting his hands dirty. He wouldn't be misunderstood in that way. He made that clear that he had a library, he had money, he had his friends were educated, and so they would know exactly that he would be a gentleman farmer. But the Roman sort of the allusions to ancient Rome, that was just actually one inspiration. There was also sort of a Quaker angle on this, and he could look to his father, who had his plantation on the banks of the Delaware. And he aspired to have his own country seat. The woman he eventually married, Mary Norris, the daughter of Isaac Norris, who was the most powerful Quaker in the colony as Speaker of the Assembly. He had a very genteel estate also on the banks of the Delaware, and so there was this Quaker ideal of retreating from the bustle of the world, going inward, and communing with nature, finding God, and then listening to what God tells you through your conscience, and then going back into the world to do good. And so he had these two things in mind, both the Roman ideal and the Quaker ideal.
Now, in the first letter, he writes about the New York legislature being suspended. What happened there?
Well, so when after the Quartering Act, which it's a misnomer that there were several Quartering Acts, and it was a misnomer that the British were quartering soldiers in people's homes. That didn't happen. It was to quarter soldiers in outbuildings, barns, or sheds. And the New York legislature simply said that they would not enforce that. And so, as punishment, Parliament said, "Fine, you don't enforce it. Your legislature won't meet." And if the legislature can't meet, they can't pass laws. They can't govern the colony. And so it was a very dangerous and threatening act that Dickinson feared. What could happen to one colony could happen to any colony.
Now, he says in that first letter that if the British Parliament has the legal authority to issue an order and to compel obedience, they have the same right to issue an order for us to supply these troops with arms, clothes, and every necessary. In some of these essays, in the letters, he often will argue that one small thing will ultimately lead to these other things, or will justify these other things. What were his concerns there?
So as an attorney, he was acutely aware of the importance of precedent. So the British Constitution was unwritten. It was a sort of an amalgam of common law, practice, statute law, a few written documents such as the Magna Carta and the 1689 Bill of Rights. But when your Constitution is unwritten, precedent becomes even more important. And so, for example, if the British passed, say the Stamp Act, and colonists went along with that, and even if they didn't like it, they went along with it, they're agreeing to recognize this act would set the precedent for that act being legal. And once that act was legal, then Parliament could continue to issue other such acts, and they could just refer to the colonists' earlier behavior and said, well, you obeyed this act, you accepted this act, that means we can impose these other acts. So that was one way that precedent was dangerous. And then speaking particularly to the issue of raising a revenue and supplying these soldiers with arms, that spoke to another perennial concern of Americans, which was the threat of a standing army. And the idea was that if there was a standing army, it was paid mercenaries. These would be people who would be interested only in the money that they could get, and they weren't necessarily patriotic. They didn't care about their countrymen, and they would just fight and oppress the people. And so it was a danger, especially in a place like Pennsylvania, where there was the Pennsylvania Assembly of Quakers was not keen on raising a militia to defend the colony against attacks by the French or by Native Americans. And so there was always this threat that, well, if the Quakers don't raise their own army, well, maybe the Crown will, and you might have British soldiers ready to just to take over and control everything that you do.
Now, throughout the essays, there's a discussion about what types of taxes are legitimate or not, and seems to be an agreement that those that regulate trade are acceptable, but those that raise revenue are not. Why was that distinction important?
So. Yes, it was accepted that trade could be regulated, but raising a revenue was not. And the reason it goes to just the basic fact of representation. Giving money to the king or to Parliament was historically seen as a gift by the people, and a gift has to be freely given, and it cannot be freely given if the people do not have a say in the act that's being passed. And so, because there was no way that the Americans could be represented in Parliament, Dickinson and others said that means that there is no way that the Americans can be taxed except by their own legislatures. So it was a very dangerous precedent, and one that they believed would result in what they said in somewhat hyperbolic terms would result in their slavery.
Now, you mentioned the word slavery, and that is something that appears throughout the letters, but he's not necessarily referring to the institution of slavery that existed at the time. What did they mean by it in that context?
Right. So, yeah. This was, as I said, it was hyperbolic. They did not have any illusions that they would end up like the African American slaves that they themselves held in bondage. They didn't. When they spoke about shackles and chains, it was purely metaphorical. But what they meant was that their liberty would be taken away because they would not have a say in their laws. They wouldn't be represented, and the Crown or Parliament could come in and take their property without their consent. So this was a common way to refer to the dangers of unbridled British authority. But although Dickinson used this language as freely as anybody, it seems that he was the only one of the leading figures to actually recognize the hypocrisy of his own language, because really after the Declaration of Independence was issued and signed, at one of his first opportunities that he had, he freed his slaves. He freed them, all of his slaves, and he had a good number of slaves. It's not clear exactly how many, possibly 60 to 80, so not a small number. And he first freed them conditionally, that they would have to be in service for 21 years, I believe, and then they would be freed. But that he did that in 1777, but that didn't sit well with him, and so he gradually started thinking about what more he could do, and so he issued a couple of other manumission deeds, one in 1781 and one in 1786. And in these, he freed all of his slaves unconditionally. And he also provided in one of his wills, people frequently wrote multiple wills. In one of his wills, he provided reparations for his slaves, and he did this while he was alive as well. He especially wanted to care for the widows among his former slaves. So he rented land to them for just a nominal fee, like $1 a year. He would provide them with foodstuffs, with a cloth for clothing, and sometimes he actually provided them money. And he also set aside some land and possibly some funds in Delaware, specifically for a school to educate black people in reading, writing, religion, that sort of thing. And so whereas today, we look at this and say, well, it's not quite enough, but it was far more than any of the leading founders at the time. None of them freed their slaves and paid reparations. At the most, I think Benjamin Franklin had one or two slaves who he eventually freed before his death, but he took a while doing it. Washington freed his slaves, the ones he owned in his will, but none of the others went this far. And Dickinson also wrote abolition legislation for Delaware, and he spoke against slavery in the Constitutional Convention, and got some provisions added to the Constitution to end the slave trade and to not use language that would suggest that slavery was actually a legal thing, an accepted legal institution. We always wish that someone like Dickinson would have done more, but he went farther than anybody else, any other leader of the era.
Did he write about his changing views on slavery?
Not a whole lot. There is a note on his first manumission deed written by his daughter, and she said that he did write a couple of things, but his daughter noted that after that first manumission deed, he basically couldn't live with himself, and thought, when he dies and he's standing at heaven's gate, he just wouldn't be able to meet the recording angel with a clear conscience unless he did this. And he did write on occasion about speaking to, for example, the Delaware legislature, pleading with them to not separate families and to treat their slaves at least kindly, if not free them. He was concerned about the slaves themselves, but he was also concerned about slavery as an institution, as something that could fundamentally threaten the American experiment. That slavery was always going to be a danger from within, and it needed to be eradicated if we were to survive as a unified polity.
Now, I want to go back to the letters. In the third letter, he begins by acknowledging that people are commenting on his first two letters. So as these were being published, was he updating his argument, or just it looked like he was interacting with people as time was unfolding?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to tell. We do not have the drafts of these letters. We have the drafts of many other of the publications that Dickinson wrote, but unfortunately not of these. I think that they were at his house in Delaware when some Tories raided it during the war, and they allegedly took his papers and scattered them in the streets of New York, and that may be where the drafts of the farmers' letters ended up. There are no printer's copies that remain, and so we don't exactly know, but it's pretty certain that he wrote these in advance, and then published them. And but I think it's also possible that he could have adjusted them as he went along, because he knew his audiences pretty well, and he would know that they would be questioning at this point. In the third letter, why is he writing these letters? What's the purpose behind them? So he wanted to address that specifically and say, in this case, the purpose of these letters is to, defend our rights firmly but peaceably, respecting the British Constitution, and not doing anything that is that's going to possibly lead to bloodshed or any kind of rift with the mother country.
Now, also in the third letter, he presents a series of steps for redressing grievances, where he says the government can sometimes do things that are wrong, but that doesn't dissolve the obligation between governors and the governed. That is the duty of the governor to rectify the situation by presenting their grievances. And he says if their applications are disregarded, then that kind of opposition becomes justifiable, which can't be made without breaking the law or disturbing the public peace. Harsh methods cannot be proper until milder ones have failed. And then at the very end of that, he mentions that the English history affords frequent examples to resistance by force if the grievances haven't been addressed. He seems to kind of work his way step by step up to this resistance by force.
Right. There's a continuum, and this was not a new idea. There were, depending on what sort of political persuasion you were, whether you identified as a Whig or a Tory, you all started at the same place. Every British subject would start with the most mild form, and that would be, they said, praying and petitioning for relief. So you would, present your grievances. You would, pray. You would, pray to God, but also, a prayer is a request to the king to intercede and to relieve you of your suffering. And so that was a starting point for everybody. But if you were a Tory, that was your starting point and your ending point. That's as far as you really were allowed to go. Unless you would include this sort of just sort of passive obedience, you just kind of go limp and not really obey or not really disobey. Then if you were a Whig, there really wasn't much in between. You pretty much went from praying and petitioning, and then if that didn't work, your next your next step was rioting. So you went, from writing to rioting to violence, and then from there, if you're following John Locke, you went to revolution. And so there was this idea that there was a contract between the governed and the government, and that if the contract was broken by the king or the government, that you had the right to overthrow that tyrannical government and replace it with one that would protect you. So now this is where Quakers come in. They had an entirely different view of this. They also believed in beginning with praying and petitioning. But they did not believe in revolution. Yet they were also not people who believed in passivity. Quakers were pacifists, but they were not passive. And so that's when they. And I should note that they were also one of the most, if not the most persecuted groups in 17th century England. They were brutalized far beyond any other group with gruesome punishments and beatings and imprisonment. And their reaction to this was to formulate this theory and practice of civil disobedience, where you preserve the Constitution, you show respect for the Constitution by breaking the laws that are unconstitutional, and then after you've broken those laws, you quietly, peacefully, and with love in your heart accept the punishment for breaking those laws. And the way this works is that it brings publicity. It makes you a martyr, and martyrs get attention, they get publicity, and they get people who become sort of converts to their cause. And so so this was a way to more or less change the Constitution from the bottom up by convincing people that your cause is the righteous one. And it doesn't put the actual unity of the polity in jeopardy. And so the Quakers did this first. Dickinson came along and popularized this, and then we see it crop up over the course of American history until the most definitive, clearest statement of this Quaker civil disobedience, comes in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And he wrote this at the urging of Quakers, and then Quakers were the first, they published the first 50,000 copies of the letter from a Birmingham jail. And now civil disobedience is seen as an acceptable form of protest, but for many, for a couple of centuries, I would say 3 centuries, or almost 3 centuries, it was considered to be seditious and treasonous, and people had a hard time kind of wrapping their brains around it. But Dickinson, he came out and he advocated this form of protest, and to be clear, civil disobedience, it does no violence to persons or property, and it's also done publicly, so a lot of people want to say that the Boston Tea Party was an act of civil disobedience, but it actually wasn't. It destroyed property. It was done in the dark of night. It was done with people in disguise, and nobody accepted any punishment for it. But Dickinson, he put forth these ideas that he then reiterated in the farmers' letters, and he kept advocating this all throughout the contest.
So he wrote these essays in the form of letters, and each has a salutation. And was that an accepted literary form for public discussion at the time?
Yes, it was, and there was a long tradition of this, and I have some evidence that he might have been inspired by Jonathan Swift, who wrote a series of letters called the Drapier's Letters, and these were written to alert Irishmen, people of Ireland, to an issue where the British were trying to oppress them by, I believe it was changing the value of coinage. And so he wrote these letters, and it allowed the Irish to resist this British encroachment on their liberties. And then there were other, there were Cato's letters, or they're probably the most famous. But yes, it was an acceptable and effective literary genre.
Now, in the last letter, letter number 12, he talks about virtue, and he talks about the decay of virtue. A people is traveling fast to destruction when individuals consider their interest as distinct from those of the public. What did virtue mean to the colonists at that time?
Right. So virtue was really a key term and a key idea. Virtue was everything. So it was seen to be mainly a masculine trait, and it meant that you were a good synonym for virtue was disinterestedness. Now, a lot of people misunderstand this word today. Disinterest is not the same as uninterest or lack of interest. Disinterestedness, it's basically, it means impartiality. So, if you have a judge, you want the judge to be disinterested. And so virtue meant that you were disinterested. It meant that you could engage in public affairs and not think about your own personal gain. And a gentleman's virtue, and it was mainly seen that gentlemen had virtue, women not so much, and certainly not poor people. But virtue was almost shorthand for one's reputation and one's credit. And so, if you were, lacking in virtue, you would have a hard time, getting a loan. You would have a hard time. It was like a credit card almost. So a gentleman's virtue was all he had. It was the most important thing that he had.
Now, in letter number 10, he references Ireland and talks about how Ireland was being treated by the British government. So were the colonists seeing this in Ireland, and did they think that was possibly foreshadowing what was going to happen to them?
To some degree, yes. I think that was really more the purview of the elite who had the privilege to be able to educate themselves on a situation that was pretty far removed from themselves, and so it was in a way sort of shorthand for Dickinson to suggest that yes, if we don't resist now, this fate will also befall us. And so, as a cautionary tale. But that was something that would be more an argument that would resonate with the more literate in his audience.
Now, one of the words that he repeats throughout the letters is innovation. What did he mean by innovation?
Yes, that's another interesting place. There are many words in the English language that we use today that are positive, but were actually quite negative at the time. Innovation was one of those words. It was sort of, it went hand in hand with precedent. And so innovation in an unwritten constitution, you don't want innovation because it's dangerous. You don't know what you're getting. It destabilizes things. And so it was better just to take a more kind of conservative approach and not try to change things too much. Because, again, if you don't have a mechanism in your Constitution for making change, that change will happen either possibly not at all, possibly so slowly that you don't recognize it, or it will be drastic and violent, like a revolution. And so innovation was something that especially a well-trained lawyer would want to avoid and would want to warn against.
How were his letters perceived in England?
Well, as they were, they had a very positive reception in America overall. But it was, strictly speaking, it was mixed because there were people who disagreed with them, albeit in the minority. In England, it was the same. We can see in the newspapers and the pamphlets that there were many responses, and there were many people who said, "These are wonderful." He writes in a fluid, manly style, and everybody should read these letters. And then there were supporters of the ministry who said, said, "Oh, it would be better for everybody if Dickinson had never learned to read and write," and they were referenced in Parliament as something treasonous. And so, both sides of the coin, but regardless, they really made Dickinson seem to be the spokesman for the American cause.
Was Dickinson worried about retaliation? He did sign it a farmer rather than with his own name.
Well, I don't know that he was really actually worried about that. I mean, using a pen name had various purposes. Yes, it was to hide your identity, because in this day and age, libel was not considered the way we consider it today. Today we say, well, if it's true, it's not libel. But in this age, if you wrote anything against the government, it was considered to be seditious libel, whether it was true or not. And so there'd be a certain degree of protection that he could get from using a pen name. But he also he didn't want any reputation that he had already acquired to influence people unduly. He wanted the argument to be accepted on its own merit. So there was that. And he also, I think, in a very sort of savvy way, he wanted to put forth this persona of someone who Americans could aspire to emulate. And this very virtuous farmer was exactly that kind of person, and I think also Dickinson aspired to be this person. I think he achieved it largely, but I think it was an ideal version of himself that he was reminding himself to live up to.
Now, there are 12 letters, and he touches on different arguments in the different letters, but was there one overriding theme, or was there one big takeaway that he wanted his audience to come away with?
Yes, I mean, I think it was sort of a twin concern, and it was that he wanted to educate people about their rights and liberties and ensure that they would resist firmly but peaceably. It was the peaceful resistance that was the most important, and he repeated over and over again that he would be very sorry if anybody mistook his letters to be advocating anything other than peaceful resistance. The last thing he wanted was bloodshed or revolution and separation. Unfortunately, people saw in these letters what they wanted to see, and that's true, or remained true, even in the centuries since they were written. People saw these letters as advocating revolution, and hence Dickinson has received the title of Penman of the Revolution, which is really ironic because he did not want revolution, and it's very clear in these letters.
How was he perceived after these letters came out? Did people eventually find out that he wrote them?
Yes, his identity was revealed probably around March, I think it was, and he was idolized. He was toasted. There were portraits done and statues done in wax and etchings in copper and gold, and poems written, pamphlets dedicated, books dedicated, poems, if I didn't say that before, and he was really, his opponents made fun of. We can only call these people really his fans, and they were ridiculed by his enemy Joseph Galloway, as the divine farmer, and so yeah, he was really seen as an American hero, and the other thing that sort of I would say sort of boosted these the popularity of these was that he wrote that summer, the summer of 1768. He wrote America's first patriotic song, which caught on like wildfire. I like to joke with my students that it was America's first #1 hit single, and it was sung in taverns across the colonies. And so people would they would for example, at the anniversary of the repeal of the Stamp Act, they would sing the Liberty Song or the Song of Liberty as it came to be called, and toast the farmer, or toast the farmer and then sing the farmer's song. And so it was really a great way to sort of embed these principles in people's minds. And I should also say, going back to your question about what was Dickinson's main purpose, in addition to peaceful resistance, the other thing that Dickinson saw that was necessary much earlier than a lot of the other leading founders was that he wanted America to unify. He knew that that America would never, the colonies working independently of one another would never succeed in holding off Britain, that they had to act in unison, they had to unite, they had to act as one. And so, before the farmers' letters, the colonies were really just quite, they were like separate countries. Some of them had different languages, they had different religions, they had different governments, and they really were not at all united, and that was a problem. Actually, well, maybe it's still a problem, but he got the colonies united in a way they had never been before, and one of the results of this was that he helped Americans see that they had a distinct identity separate from being British, and that yet, yes, they were all connected through Britain, but now he wanted them to see that they were actually Americans connected by virtue of being Americans, and that they had similar interests. And so he added a line in his Liberty Song, united we stand, divided we fall. And that wasn't a new sentiment, but he popularized it and got people saying it and toasting to it over and over.
We only have a couple of minutes left. Did his arguments have any effect on the British Parliament? Did they change their concept of their own power over the colonies?
It angered them. I think that Parliament was too kind of tone deaf and too intent on asserting its authority to be anything but angered and annoyed by these letters. They did take it as sort of the tenor of the American attitude, but it didn't bring them to sort of any sort of rational decision. It just made them come down on America harder than they had before.
Well, we've been speaking with Jane Calvert. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Kentucky and the director and editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project. Jane, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Enjoying this podcast? Visit PCNTV.com to find out how to support our mission. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network. You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.